How accessible is Israel for tourists who are wheelchair users? Hi, my name is Robyn Saunders. I am completing this project as a capstone for my Accessibility Studies minor, which I plan to complete in the spring of 2023. I am an undergrad student here at Central Washington University. I am majoring in interdisciplinary studies with a minor in accessibility studies. I also have completed an Associate of Technical Arts degree in Human Services at Skagit Valley College in 2016. My perspective is that travel should be available to everyone, no matter what they use to navigate the world. Going to Israel is the trip of a lifetime for many, but is it accessible to everyone who would like to experience it? The purpose of this project is to assess how accessible Israel is for wheelchair users. Israel has put a lot of effort into making many of the sites accessible. However, many of the sites have been excavated by archeologists, which can make it difficult to make them accessible. For instance, at some of the sites, lack of signage, narrow doors, and the type of materials used in the pathways were all potential barriers for wheelchair users. Because this was a guided tour, there was a limited amount of time available at each location. My husband, son, and I had the privilege of traveling to Israel with a group of 20 people. When we decided to go on this trip, I started to think about what it must be like for those who have limited mobility, people who use assistive technology in their everyday lives, such as walkers or wheelchairs. As exciting and stressful as getting ready to go on this trip was for me, I can only imagine the difficulty that comes when traveling with assistive technology. This issue is important because the number of people that would like to travel but don't because they don't know if the destination is going to be accessible. My audience for this information is wheelchair users and their companions. I hope that by conducting this research, I can bring awareness that travel for wheelchair users is possible in Israel. The fact that Israel is a foreign country could have meant that they have very different laws around people with disabilities. However, Israel passed the Equal Rights for People with Disability law in 1998. The Americans with Disabilities Act had a large influence and was used as a template for how this law was written in Israel. There are some differences, but Israel and the US both have laws in place to help provide equity for their citizens with disability. According to the Next Tourism Generation Alliance, the definition of accessible tourism says that it enables people with access limitations in mobility, vision, hearing, and cognitive dimensions to function independently and with equity and dignity by delivering universal design tourism products, services, and environments. I also would consider the environmental model to align with my project because this model states that people with disabilities, environments, both physical and social, can cause, define, or exaggerate a disability. There is always a relationship between the disability and the physical environment. Another way to put it is that disability is a product of a disabling, insensitive environment. The environmental model states that society is responsible for changing the environment to work for people with disabilities. A good example of this is how the ADA has made it a shift in the environment for people with disabilities and wheelchairs. For example, sidewalk cutouts, elevators, and ramps are now expected part of the community. Something else to consider is how important it is when starting on new construction that builders keep in mind the laws, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act or Equal Rights for People with Disabilities law. However, there is another way to ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are met in designing a building, and this is known as universal design. Universal design is helpful not only for people with disabilities, but also for parents with strollers, the aging population, or people recovering from short-term disabilities. The way universal design works is that the building is designed in a way that it will meet most, if not all, people's needs from the start, so they do not have to go back and change it later. The scope of my project was mostly about physical disabilities with the need to use a wheelchair. And my research question is, how accessible is travel for wheelchair users in Israel? The mobility experiences of a 10-day trip to Israel were documented in a journal. The journal includes both written and photographic information about the accessible nature of each attraction attended. The journal was then reviewed for accessibility according to the guidelines of the host and the destination countries, and there was no need for HSRC approval for this project. This chart includes all 31 sites that we visited during our 10-day stay in Israel. I rated each site as fully accessible, partially accessible, or not at all accessible. And yes, much of Israel is accessible for wheelchair users, but not all of it. Out of the 31 venues we visited while in Israel, 8 were fully accessible, 20 were partially accessible, and 3 were not accessible at all. But one, the Dead Sea, did have an alternate area for people with disabilities that would be considered accessible. The use of pictures and prior knowledge base of accessibility studies were the primary sources of information related to the findings. My findings did answer my research question because I was able to see firsthand how accessible Israel is for those traveling with wheelchair users. I was pleasantly surprised how accessible many of the attractions we visited were. There is still work to be done, but they are well on their way. I think that if I could share my research, that some small changes could be made that would make a big difference. There does need to be further research on website accessibility with regards to stating how accessible their tourist attraction is and if they offer any accommodations. I spent a lot of time online trying to find information about accessibility on the websites for each attraction, and it was not easy to find. There were a few exceptions, but I had to run searches to find any information. Most places were more accessible than I thought they would be. However, there is no way for me to know this until I got there. I plan to share this information with the hope that this might change. When I look back at the time I spent in Israel, the one thing I would change is how much time we got to spend at each venue. Because of the time constraints, I was not able to answer all of my questions, which did limit the scope of my findings. I would also like to say thank you to my mentors for helping me and guiding me through this process. Thank you to Michael Hogan for planning and organizing my trip to Israel, which was a life-changing experience. My next steps are to graduate this summer with a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies and a master's in accessibility studies. I am the wife of a 100% disabled veteran and the mom of 2 sons with autism. I will never stop advocating for people with disabilities. I will also continue to advocate for my aging mother and anyone else who may need my help in the future. These last 2 slides include the references that I used while researching my project. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.